A cold wind screams across the high chaparral, rattling the lone cabin of Ilara Harrington. Inside the hearth is dead stone, a mirror of the emptiness in her life since her husband passed. Then, a sound that should not be. A thin, desperate cry, coming not from the storm outside, but from the cold ashes of the hearth itself. Ilara finds him. A baby, wrapped in strange symbols, his skin the color of rich earth. She takes in the abandoned Hopi child, an act of mercy that will cost her everything. But days later, when the town gathers with torches, a new force arrives. A Hopi chief, not with arrows of war, but with songs of gratitude that will unravel a mystery of poison, revenge, and a prophecy she never knew she was part of. The wind was a living thing. It clawed at the sod roof of Ilara Harrington's cabin, a mournful howl that had become the only voice she ever heard. Out here, 12 miles from the nascent, judgmental cluster of buildings known as Redemption Creek, silence was a predator, and the wind was its cry. Ilara was a widow. The word felt brittle in her mouth, like dry alkali dust. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man of quiet strength and loud dreams. Those dreams were now buried under a simple wooden cross on the ridge, a victim of the same coughing sickness that had taken so many. He had left her this cabin, built with his own hands, and a loneliness so vast it rivaled the painted desert sky. Tonight, the storm was a bad one. A late October cold snap had turned the persistent Arizona rain into a biting, freezing sleet. Ilara pulled her shawl tighter. The hearth was cold. She had let the fire die hours ago, the small pile of juniper and mesquite logs nearby seeming too much of an effort. What was the point of warmth when the cold was bone deep, a permanent resident in her soul? She sat at the rough-hewn table, Thomas's ledger open before her. His neat, fading script detailed lists of seeds, pounds of flour, and the cost of 2 mules. It was a ghost. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sleet hit the wooden shutters of the single window. She was barred in. The heavy oak door was secured with its thick iron latch. The chimney flue was tight. She was as sealed in as a body in a coffin. And that is when she heard it. It was not the wind. It was not the scuttling of a pack rat. It was a thin, reedy wail, a sound of such profound, nascent misery that it pierced the fog of her grief like a needle. Ilara froze. Her heart, a dormant stone, suddenly hammered against her ribs. She looked around the cabin's single room, the rope bed in the corner, the dry sink, the table, the hearth. The sound came again, stronger this time, bouncing off the cold stones of the fireplace. Whoa. Impossible. It was impossible. She was alone. She had been alone for 8 months. Perhaps the wind was playing tricks. Perhaps her mind, starved of human contact, was finally conjuring phantoms. She stood slowly, the chair scraping on the plank floor. She picked up the kerosene lamp, its yellow glow casting frantic, leaping shadows. She approached the hearth. It was a wide, deep fireplace, built of river rock and clay, stained black with the soot of 1,000 fires, and there, nestled in the absolute center of the cold, grey ashes, was a bundle. It was not a bundle of rags. It was moving. "Dear God in heaven," Ilara whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. She knelt, placing the lamp on the stone lip. The bundle was a cradle board, but not one she recognized. It was simple, woven from willow, but the blankets swaddling it were unlike any settler's wool. They were tightly woven cotton, dyed in geometric patterns of indigo, black, and a startling, vivid yellow. The symbols were Hopi. She knew that much, the tribe from the high mesas, the ones the settlers in Redemption Creek spoke of, with a mixture of fear and contempt. The Cloud People. A tiny, perfect, bronze-skinned hand flailed out from the swaddling. Ilara's breath hitched. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the outline of the bundle. How, in the name of all that was holy, had a baby materialized inside her barred and locked cabin, in a cold hearth, in the middle of a frozen night? She looked at the door. Barred. The window. Shuttered. She looked up the chimney flue. It was narrow, choked with soot, and covered by a metal cap to keep the rain out. Not even a cat could have come down that way, let alone a person carrying a child. The baby's cry escalated, a desperate, hungry sound. Grief, logic, and fear warred within her. This was a bad omen. This was a curse. Prudence Holloway, the preacher's wife in town, would call this a devil's changeling. Sheriff Bart Grissom would call it an incursion. But Ilara Harrington, who had held her dying husband's hand and prayed for a mercy that never came, only saw a child. She lifted the cradle board. It was surprisingly light. The baby was tiny, no more than a few weeks old. His face was screwed up in a red mask of distress. He had a shock of straight, jet-black hair. She unlaced the swaddling, her fingers clumsy. The baby was a boy. He was cold. His small body was shivering violently. He had been left here to be found, or he had been left here to die. The cold ashes were a clear signal. Hush now, Ilara found herself murmuring, the sound of her own voice strange. Hush. You are found. You are found. She brought the baby to her chest, wrapping him in her own wool shawl. The small, cold body pressed against her. The crying softened, hitched, and then subsided into tiny snuffing breaths. He rooted against her collarbone, seeking warmth, seeking life. A feeling so fierce and protective that it physically hurt lanced through Ilara. It was a pain that was the exact opposite of grief. It was the pain of a dry well, suddenly, violently, filling with water. She looked back at the hearth. The mystery remained. Who had done this? And how? The wind howled its ignorance. She checked the door again, still barred from the inside. The shutters. Latched. It was as if he had been conjured from the stone itself. Asher, she whispered, the name coming to her unbidden. A name from her mother's Bible. It meant blessed or happy. It felt like a defiance against the storm. I will call you Asher. She stoked the embers of her own will. She went to the woodpile and, for the first time in months, she built a fire. She found the last of her canned milk, diluting it with boiled water, and dipped a clean rag in it for the baby to suckle. He ate with a desperate, frantic energy. Ilara sat in her rocking chair, the one Thomas had built, and held the sleeping child. The fire leapt in the hearth, throwing warm, golden light on the face of the Hopi baby. The cold, empty cabin finally felt full. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her gut like a stone, that this act would not be borne in silence. The world outside, the world of Redemption Creek, would not allow it. She had just crossed a line. She had taken in a savage, an other. But as she looked down at the child, his small hand clutching her finger, Ilara Harrington knew she would sooner burn in the fires of hell than let him go. The mystery of his arrival didn't matter. The danger that was surely coming didn't matter. She had a purpose again. The hearth was no longer cold. Dawn broke grey and spiteful. The storm had passed, leaving the high desert scrubland coated in a thin, treacherous layer of ice. The world looked like shattered glass. Ilara had not slept. She had watched the baby, Asher, as he slept in a hastily constructed bed, a wooden crate padded with her softest linens, placed far enough from the fire to be safe, close enough to be warm. His breathing was light, but steady. He was a survivor. But survival required more than warmth. He needed milk, real milk, and clothes. The canned condensed milk was a stopgap, and the beautiful, strange, Hopi swaddling clothes were all he had. Her decision meant facing the town. Ilara harnessed her mule, Clementine, to the buckboard. The simple act felt monumental. She wrapped Asher tightly, securing him in a sling against her chest, hidden beneath her heavy canvas coat. The small, warm weight was a comfort and a terror. The 12-mile ride to Redemption Creek was a frozen ordeal. The wagon wheels cracked through the ice, the air sharp and clean in her lungs. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. She felt small, exposed. Every boulder, every cluster of skeletal mesquite looked like a watching eye. Redemption Creek was hardly a town. It was a street, ankle-deep in mud and mule droppings, bracketed by 24 false-fronted buildings. It existed for one reason, the silver mine that had yet to pay out, but which held the townsfolk in a grip of desperate, greedy hope. She tied Clementine to the hitching rail outside Silas Vane's General Mercantile. The sign creaked on its hinges, a sound like a rusty throat clearing. Ilara pulled her bonnet low, adjusted the sling, and pushed the door open. A small bell tinkled. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee beans, cured tobacco, new denim, and coal smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the center. Silas Vane, a man whose face was a roadmap of anxiety, was weighing flour for another customer. That customer was Prudence Holloway. Ilara's stomach tightened. Prudence was the town's self-appointed moral compass, a gaunt woman who dressed in severe black and saw sin in every shadow. Her husband, the preacher, was a man of timid sermons. Prudence was the fire and brimstone. "Mrs. Harrington," Silas said, his voice hesitant. He'd been fond of Thomas. "A surprise to see you. A bad storm." "Silas," Ilara nodded, forcing her voice to be steady. "I need supplies." Prudence Holloway turned. Her eyes, small and black as boot buttons, swept over Ilara. They missed nothing. They lingered on the bulky shape beneath Ilara's coat. "Ilara," Prudence said, her voice lacking all warmth. "We had thought the grief had taken you for good. We have not seen you at services in months. The ride is long, Mrs. Holloway, and my grief is my own." Ilara turned to Silas, ignoring the woman. "I need goat's milk, if you have it, and flannel, the softest you have." Silas paused, his scoop halfway to the flour sack. "Goat's milk? I might have a can." But Asher, disturbed by the new voices and the cold air, chose that moment to stir. He let out a small, mewling cry from inside her coat. The store went utterly silent. The only sound was the crackle of the stove. Prudence Holloway's face, already pale, turned to marble. "What?" she said. The word clipped. "Is that?" Ilara met her gaze. The time for hiding was over. She unbuttoned her coat, revealing the baby's dark-haired head nestled against her chest. Silas Vane dropped the flour scoop. It clattered on the floor, sending up a white puff. "Good Lord preserve us," Prudence breathed, taking a step back as if Ilara had revealed a snake. "What have you done?" "I found him," Ilara said, her hand instinctively covering Asher's head. "Found?" Prudence's voice rose, becoming a shrill instrument of judgment. "Found where? That is a heathen child, an Apache, a Hopi. It's a savage." "He's a baby," Ilara said, her voice low and dangerous. "And he was cold and hungry. You brought it here, into this God-fearing town?" Prudence looked wildly at Silas. "She's brought a curse upon us. Everyone knows what they are. They steal children. They murder decent folk in their beds. This is an omen." "He's just a child, Prudence," Silas stammered, wringing his hands. "Now, Ilara, Perhaps the sheriff should be involved. The sheriff will be involved, a new voice boomed. The door swung open again, filling the doorway. Sheriff Bartholomew Bart Grissom. He was a large man, made larger by a buffalo hide coat and the silver star pinned to his chest. He lived by a simple, brutal code. Anything that disrupted the town's fragile, greedy order was to be crushed, and a Hopi baby was a disruption. His eyes, the color of dirty ice, landed on Asher. He did not look surprised. News traveled fast in a town this small and suspicious. Someone must have seen her ride in. "Harrington," he growled, stepping inside. He didn't remove his hat. "What in the blue blazes do you think you're doing?" "I'm buying milk, Sheriff," Ilara said, standing her ground. "You're inviting trouble," Grissom snapped. "That thing belongs on the mesa, or in the ground. It doesn't belong with a white woman." "His name is Asher," Ilara said, her chin high. "And he was left at my hearth. I took him in." "Left at your hearth?" Grissom scoffed. "You mean one of them savages broke into your cabin? We'll have to ride out. Teach them a lesson." "No one broke in," Ilara said, realizing her mistake too late. "The door was barred. I don't know how he got there. He was just there." This was, she saw instantly, the worst possible thing she could have said. Prudence Holloway gasped, a hand flying to her throat. "A changeling! I knew it! Witchcraft! The devil's work! She's communing with them!" "Shut up, Prudence!" Grissom barked, though he looked unsettled. He stepped closer to Ilara, his sheer bulk intimidating. He smelled of stale whiskey and gun oil. "Listen to me, widow," he said, his voice a low threat. "I don't care if it was dropped by an angel or crawled up from hell. You will give that child to me. I'll see he's handled, taken to the reservation agent up north, or if he doesn't make the trip, no one will be the worse for it." The implication was horrific. "Handled?" "No," Ilara said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Grissom's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't a request. You are endangering this entire town. When the Hopi find him missing, where do you think they'll come looking? When they send a war party, whose door will they be at? Mine. Yours. They'll burn us all out, all for one little redskin." "He was abandoned," Ilara insisted, her heart pounding. "Left, in the cold, to die. His own people didn't want him." "Then you should have let him!" Prudence shrieked. "It was God's will!" "That's enough!" Ilara's voice cracked like a whip. She looked past Grissom, at Silas. "Silas, the milk, the flannel. Now." Silas Vane looked from Grissom's furious face to Ilara's desperate one. He was a man trapped, but he was, at his core, a shopkeeper. He scurried behind the counter, grabbed a can of goat's milk and a bolt of white flannel. "How much?" Ilara asked, never taking her eyes off the sheriff. "No charge, Ilara. Just go." "Please," Silas whispered. "You're making a mistake, Harrington," Grissom said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. It was not a threat of violence, not yet. It was a threat of the law. A fatal one. "He is under my protection, Sheriff. You want him. You'll have to come through me." She clutched the supplies, turned, and walked out of the store. The bell tinkled her exit. She could feel their eyes on her back. She untied Clementine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the knot. She climbed onto the buckboard, settled Asher, and snapped the reins. As she rode out of Redemption Creek, she did not look back. She saw no one. But the town's silence was louder than any gunshot. It was the sound of doors being barred, the sound of a community turning its back. She was no longer just a widow. She was an outcast, a heathen lover. And she knew, with the cold certainty of the ice on the road, that Sheriff Grissom was a man who kept his word. They would come for the child. The next 2 weeks were a strange, hermetic dream. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, to the cycle of feeding, sleeping, and stoking the fire. Ilara's grief, that vast, empty desert, was pushed back by the immediate, demanding reality of a new life. Asher was a quiet baby, but his eyes were bright and alert. He would watch her, his gaze intense, as if he were memorizing her face. Ilara found a new rhythm. She learned the exact temperature he liked his milk. She learned to bathe him in the tin basin, his small, slippery body, a marvel of perfect limbs. She sang to him, old lullabies her mother had sung to her, her voice rusty at first, then clearer, stronger. The cabin, once a tomb, was now a nursery. But the world outside didn't forget. The first sign came 3 days after her visit to town. She woke to find a small, meticulously woven pouch on her doorstep. It was made of yucca fiber. Inside was a cup of fine, blue cornmeal. Ilara stared at it. Her cabin was 12 miles from town, and even further from the Hopi mesas. No settler used blue corn. She scanned the horizon, the vast expanse of rust-colored rock and juniper. Nothing. Not a footprint in the damp earth, not a wisp of smoke. She brought the pouch inside, her heart a drum. Was it a threat? A warning? Or a gift? She didn't know. She put it on the high shelf, unsettled. A week later, she went to the wood pile. A massive, diamond-back rattlesnake lay coiled near the splitting stump, its head severed by a single, clean cut. An arrow, fletched with dark, unfamiliar feathers, was stuck in the ground beside it. Someone had been here. Someone had watched her, seen the danger, and eliminated it without a sound. She was being guarded. This realization brought a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of Grissom's brute force. It was an uncanny, spectral fear. She was caught between 2 worlds, and both were watching her. The watchers from the mesa were silent and protective. The watchers from the town were loud and full of malice. On the 15th day after her trip, they came. Ilara saw the dust plume first, a dirty brown smear against the afternoon sky. It was too large for a single rider. She secured Asher in his crate, pulled her late husband's Winchester rifle from its pegs above the door, and checked the load. Thomas had taught her to shoot. "Out here," he'd said, "a gun is a far better neighbor than a prayer." She didn't bar the door. She stood in the center of the room, the rifle held loosely, and waited. There were 5 riders. Sheriff Grissom was in the lead. Beside him, perched absurdly on a sway-backed mare, was Prudence Holloway, her face a mask of righteous fury. Dr. Elias Thorne was with them, a man Ilara had once respected, but who now looked small and ashamed. The other 2 were miners, hard men named Jed and Cyrus, their faces blank, hired for muscle. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin. "Ilara Harrington!" Grissom yelled, his voice carrying on the clean air. "Come out! We've come on official town business!" Ilara pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. The rifle stayed in her hands, its muzzle pointed at the ground. "This is my property, Sheriff," she called back. "State your business and be on your way." "Our business is that child," Prudence Holloway shrieked, pointing a black-gloved finger. "You've kept that spawn of the devil for too long. The town is sick. Old man Hemlock's lungs have given out. A curse. You brought this curse." "Old man Hemlock has been dying for a year, Prudence," Ilara said, her voice shaking despite her resolve. "Don't you dare lay that at this child's feet." "Mrs. Harrington," Dr. Thorne spoke up, his voice placating. "Please be reasonable. The townsfolk are agitated. They fear retaliation from the tribes. They see this as a provocation. For the good of the community, you must surrender the child." For the good of the community? Ilara spat. Or for the good of the silver mine? Are you afraid the Hopi will stop trading corn? Or are you just afraid of anything that doesn't look like you? Grissom dismounted. He unhitched the coiled rope from his saddle. I'm done talking, widow. We've got a writ from the territorial magistrate. Says the child is a ward of the state, a vagrant non-citizen, and is to be remanded to my custody for transport to the agency. He had a piece of paper. He had the law. Ilara's heart sank. You're not a magistrate, Bart, Ilara said, trying to buy time. And that paper isn't worth the mud on your boots. It's enough, Grissom said, advancing. Jed and Cyrus dismounted, fanning out. We can do this the easy way, or I can deputize these men, and we can take him by force. We will not leave without the heathen. His name is Asher, Ilara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She raised the rifle. The click of the hammer being pulled back was shockingly loud. Grissom stopped. His hand went to his own pistol. You're addled, woman. You'd shoot the law? For that? You take one more step towards this porch and you will find out, Ilara said. Her arms ached, but her aim was true. She sighted on the silver star on his chest. A terrible, stretched silence fell. Prudence Holloway looked ecstatic, as if she were witnessing the righteous martyrdom she'd always craved. Dr. Thorne looked ill. Grissom weighed his options. He was a bully, but not a fool. He knew Thomas Harrington had taught his wife to shoot. He also knew that shooting a white widow in her own home, even for a good reason, was a messy affair. This ain't over, he growled, slowly raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. You can't keep us out forever, Ilara. You have to sleep. You have to get water. And that thing will be ours. This land will be cleansed. Get off my property, Ilara said, her voice a low vibration. Grissom stared at her for a long, hateful moment. Then he turned, spat in the dust, and climbed back onto his horse. You heard her, boys, he sneered. Let's leave the witch to her familiar. Prudence Holloway gave a final, damning look. You will answer to God for this, Ilara Harrington. He will not be as merciful as we have been. They turned their horses and rode away. Ilara did not lower the rifle until their dust plume was a distant memory. Only then did she collapse back against the cabin wall, sliding to the porch floor, the heavy Winchester clattering beside her. She put her face in her hands and wept. She wept from fear, from rage, and from a terrible crushing isolation. She had won. For today. But Grissom was right. She had to sleep. She had to get water. And they would be back, as the sun began to dip, painting the mesas in hues of blood and apricot. Ilara felt the watcher's presence again. She looked up at the ridge. A lone figure stood there, silhouetted against the dying light. Too far to make out features, but it was not a white man. It was still watchful. The protector. The watcher on the ridge, however, did not know what was coming next. The threat wasn't just from Grissom. A new, more terrible enemy was already inside the cabin. It was in the baby's blood. The victory against Grissom was hollow, leaving a metallic taste of fear in Ilara's mouth. She barred the door, shuttered the window, and lived in a state of siege. Every crackle of the fire, every hoot of an owl, sent her flying to the rifle. But the sheriff did not return. The silence from Redemption Creek was absolute. The watcher on the ridge, however, was a daily presence. A brace of rabbits, field-dressed, would appear on the woodpile. A bundle of dried herbs, ones she didn't recognize, left by the well. These were not gifts, she realized. They were provisions. She was being supported, sustained, by a force she could not see and did not understand. Then, 4 days after the confrontation, Asher began to cry. It was not his usual, hungry cry. It was a thin, pain-filled wail that twisted Ilara's insides. She picked him up, felt his skin. He was burning. A fever. She unwrapped him, her hands frantic. His small body was covered in a faint, mottled, reddish rash. It looked like measles, but it was wrong. The spots were too dark, almost purple at their centers. "No," Ilara breathed. "No, please, not this." She did what she knew. She bathed him in cool water. She tried to force sips of willow bark tea, a fever reducer, between his lips, but he was too weak to swallow. He thrashed, his cries becoming weaker, his breathing shallow. This was why he was left. He was sick. His mother, his people, they had left him for the sickness to take. A sickness they couldn't cure. They had left him in the cold hearth to die. The thought, which should have been a comfort, a justification, felt like a betrayal. By nightfall, the fever was raging. Asher was limp, his skin a terrifying, greyish brown. The rash was darker. Ilara was frantic. The herbs from the Watcher. She didn't know how to use them. Her own remedies were useless. She was losing him. She was losing the one thing that had pulled her from the grave of her own grief. There was only one choice, one she had sworn she would never make. She had to go back to Redemption Creek. She had to beg Dr. Thorne. Leaving Asher was impossible. She wrapped him in every blanket she owned, placed him in the buckboard, and lashed the crate down. She hitched Clementine in the dark, her hands raw. The ride to town was a waking nightmare. Every jolt of the wagon sent a new, weak cry from the baby, and a fresh stab of terror into Ilara. She arrived in town well after midnight. The street was a canyon of black-mouthed buildings. The only light came from the saloon, a sickly yellow, spilling onto the muddy street. She hammered on the door of Dr. Elias Thorne's office. It was a small building attached to his house. "Doctor!" she yelled, pounding until her knuckles were bruised. "Dr. Thorne, please, it's an emergency." A light appeared in the upstairs window. Moments later, the door opened a crack. Dr. Thorne, in his nightshirt, his face shadowed with sleep and fear, peered out. "Mrs. Harrington, what on earth?" He saw the bundle in her arms. His face clamped shut. "It's the baby," Ilara pleaded, pushing against the door. "He's burning, a rash. Please, you must help me. I have money. I'll pay anything." I cannot," Thorne stammered, his body blocking the doorway. "Cannot? You're a doctor! He's dying!" she screamed, the sound hysterical. "My practice," he whispered, casting a nervous glance down the dark street. "Grissom, Mrs. Holloway, they made it clear I am not to treat that child. They said it's a plague. They said it would infect the town." "It is not a plague," Ilara sobbed, trying to push past him. "It's a fever. You took an oath." "My oath is to this community," he hissed, his fear making him cruel. "To the good, God-fearing people of Redemption Creek, not to whatever you've brought into our midst. He's a baby. Get off my porch, Mrs. Harrington." He was stronger than he looked. He shoved her back, hard. Ilara stumbled, clutching Asher to her chest. "You'll kill him," she cried. "His people should have thought of that," Thorne said, his voice cold. "Go home. Let nature take its course." The door shut. The bolt slid home. Ilara stood on the porch, stunned. The rejection was so total, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. The saloon door opened, spilling 2 drunken miners into the street. They saw her, saw the bundle, and let out a hoot. "Looky there! It's an Injun lover! Come to show off her brat!" Laughter, cruel, sharp, and drunk. Ilara fled. She scrambled onto the buckboard and snapped the reins, Clementine lurching into a trot. She fled the lights, the laughter, the civilization that had just condemned a child to death. The long ride back was a blur of tears and a fading, whimpering cry from the crate. She got back to the cabin as a pale, sickly light began to touch the eastern sky. She carried Asher inside. He was quiet now, too quiet. His breathing was a faint, shallow whisper. The rash was a deep, dark purple. She had failed. She sat in the rocker, holding his limp body. The fire had died again. The hearth was cold. She rocked, her body moving in a rhythm of despair, tears streaming silently down her face. She was preparing to watch a second person she loved die in this cabin. "I'm sorry, Asher," she whispered, kissing his hot, dry forehead. "I'm so sorry." The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house. The cabin was dark. A sudden draught of cold air made her look up. The door was barred. The window was shuttered. But she was no longer alone. A woman stood by the hearth. She was old, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her hair the color of snow, bound in two tight coils over her ears. She was Hopi. She wore a dark wool blanket, and she was looking at Ilara with an intensity that burned. It was the Watcher. Ilara's first instinct was to scream. Her second was to reach for the rifle, but she was frozen in the rocking chair, her arms clamped around the dying child. The old woman did not move. She just watched. There was no malice in her gaze, only a profound, bottomless sorrow, and an unnerving, steely purpose. She held up one hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. "How?" Ilara whispered, her voice a raw croak. "The door is barred." The old woman ignored the question. She glided forward, her moccasins making no sound on the plank floor. She stopped in front of Ilara and looked down at Asher. Her wrinkled face tightened in a grimace of what looked like recognition. She pointed at the baby. Then she pointed at herself. She made a rocking motion, then pointed to her own breast. "My child." Your child?" Ilara stammered. "Your daughter? Is he your daughter's child?" The woman nodded curtly. She was the grandmother. She held out her arms. It was not a request, it was a command. Ilara, who had just faced down a sheriff with a rifle, found herself utterly cowed by the silent authority of this old woman. She hesitated, clutching Asher tighter. The woman's eyes softened, just for a second. She pointed at Asher, then made a gesture of sleeping, a hand against her cheek, and then a final, downward motion. "He is dying." Ilara knew it was true. This was the baby's family. Whatever magic or trick had brought her here, she had a right. With a sob, Ilara relinquished the child. The grandmother took Asher with practiced, gentle hands. She did not coddle him. She laid him on the table under the lamp and began, with methodical speed, to unwrap his blankets. She clicked her tongue at the dark, ugly rash. She turned to Ilara and pointed at the hearth. Fire, hot water. The command galvanized Ilara. She scrambled to the woodpile, stuffing kindling and logs into the cold fireplace. She worked the bellows, desperate, until a spark caught. She filled the kettle and hung it on the hook. While Ilara worked, the grandmother produced her own tools. From the folds of her blanket, she brought out a small stone mortar and pestle, and several small leather pouches. The herbs, the ones that had been left on the step. She began to crush them, adding a few drops of water, creating a thick, dark, pungent-smelling paste. The aroma was sharp, of sage and something metallic. When the water was hot, the grandmother took a clean rag, dipped it, and began to wash the baby's body. She was not just washing, she was inspecting. Her gnarled fingers moved over every inch of his small frame. Ilara watched, useless. He was fine, she babbled, needing to explain. He was healthy. Then the fever came, the rash. Dr. Thorne, the doctor in town. He wouldn't see him. He turned us away. The old woman paused. Her head snapped up, her black eyes burning into Ilara's. She understood. Her expression was terrible to behold. It was not anger. It was a cold, ancient, settled hatred. Then her fingers stopped. They were on Asher's left foot. She peered at it, bringing the lamp closer. She looked at Ilara and pointed. Ilara leaned in. On the sole of Asher's foot, almost invisible, were two tiny dark pinpricks, smaller than a freckle, surrounded by a faint, yellowish bruise. "A snake?" Ilara whispered. "But it's winter. They're all in their dens." The grandmother shook her head violently. "No." She held up two fingers, mimed a sharp, stabbing motion, and then pointed towards Redemption Creek. "Not a snake," Ilara translated, her blood running cold. "Something else. Someone did this?" The old woman's face was grim. She dipped her finger in the dark herbal paste and smeared it onto the two pinpricks. Then she took a different pouch, one with a fine yellow powder, and gently blew it into the baby's nose. Asher, who had been limp and unresponsive, suddenly convulsed. A strangled, gasping cough erupted from his lungs. It was a terrible, wet sound. The grandmother began to chant. It was a low, rhythmic sound, more of a hum than a song. She rubbed the dark paste onto the spots on his chest, her hands moving in a steady circle. "Who?" Ilara demanded, the horror of the realization dawning. Who would poison a baby? The grandmother did not stop her work. She pointed at the cradleboard, the one Ilara had kept. It was leaning against the wall. The woman gestured to it, then made the rocking motion again. His mother. She then pointed to her own heart and drew a line across her throat. "His mother is dead?" The old woman nodded. She pointed to her own foot, then mimed the same stabbing motion. "Poisoned." Ilara sank onto the bench. This wasn't a sickness. This wasn't an abandonment. This was a murder, and a failed one. "But why leave him here?" Ilara asked, gesturing around the cabin. "And how did you get in?" The grandmother's chant softened as Asher's breathing, miraculously, seemed to deepen, to lose its ragged, shallow edge. The fever still raged, but the quality of his sleep had changed. The old woman finally looked up from her work. She pointed to the hearth, where the fire now burned brightly. She walked over to it. She pointed at the baby, then at the hearth, then at Ilara. "I put baby here. For you." "But how?" Ilara insisted. "The door was locked." The grandmother knelt. She pushed aside the ash and soot at the very back of the deep fireplace. She pressed her hand against a large, seemingly solid river stone that formed the foundation. With a faint scrape, the stone pivoted inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening, just large enough for a small person to crawl through. Ilara stared, dumbfounded. The old woman pointed into the blackness. Kiva. An old place. A tunnel. It led out to the wash, 100 yards away, hidden by a tumble of boulders. "This cabin," Ilara breathed. "It's built on an old ruin." The grandmother nodded. She had known about this place. Her ancestors had built it. When her daughter was murdered, when the baby was poisoned, she had not taken him to the white man's town. She had taken him, via this hidden route, to the only white person she had ever seen show kindness. Ilara remembered, months ago, before Thomas died. A hot, dry summer. An old Hopi man walking the trader's path. His mule was lame. Ilara, seeing his distress, had brought him a full skin of water from her well and a loaf of bread. She had expected nothing. He had nodded, taken it, and left. She had been seen. She had been marked as safe. The grandmother had placed her dying grandson in Ilara's hearth, a desperate gamble, a plea to a stranger from a different world, knowing that the poisoner would be hunting for him. She had been watching ever since, protecting her, provisioning her. "Who?" Ilara asked again, her voice thick. "Who is the poisoner?" The old woman's face darkened. She pointed, not to the mesas, but directly at Redemption Creek. She mimed, digging, sifting, a prospector. Then she made a gesture of drinking, of madness, a drunk, a white man. The entire narrative Ilara had built, of a cruel tribe, of a sick, abandoned child, shattered. This was a white man's crime, and the town in its blind, racist arrogance was protecting the murderer. The grandmother returned to Asher. She sat in the rocking chair, holding him, chanting her low song. The baby's fever, which had burned like a furnace, was finally, perceptibly, beginning to cool. The dark paste on his skin seemed to be drawing the venom out, the spots already looking fainter, less angry. Ilara sat at the table, watching the woman from another time save the child in her arms. The cabin was filled with the smell of the fire, the herbs, and the sound of the ancient, healing song. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, and with it came the sound of horses. Many horses. Ilara's head snapped to the window. It wasn't the quiet approach of the Hopi. It was the heavy, clumsy, angry sound of shod horses. Grissom. He was back, and this time he had the whole town. The grandmother's song did not falter, but her eyes snapped open, alert and hard. She looked at Ilara, then at the rifle on the wall. "They've come for him," Ilara whispered, terror seizing her. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. It was worse than she imagined. It wasn't a posse. It was a mob. At least 15, maybe 20 men, led by Sheriff Grissom. Prudence Holloway was there, holding a large, guttering torch, her face illuminated in a demonic, ecstatic glow. Dr. Thorne was there, his face pale and set. They had torches. They had ropes. "Witch!" Prudence's voice carried over the morning air. "Demon lover! We've come to cleanse this place!" "Ilara Harrington!" Grissom bellowed. "By the authority of the citizens of Redemption Creek, you are accused of consorting with heathens and harboring a plague. Bring out the child, or we will burn you out." The grandmother stood. She placed the sleeping, breathing Asher into his crate and covered him. She looked at Ilara. Her face was calm. She pointed to the hidden passage in the hearth. "Go. Take him." Ilara stared at the opening. She could escape. She could take Asher and run, but where? To the mesas. She was a white woman. She would die in the wilderness. And what of this woman? They would find her. They would tear her apart. "No," Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. She grabbed the Winchester. "This is my home." She looked at the old woman. "Your name? What is your name?" The woman touched her own chest. "Sikya." It sounded like Sikya. "Sikya." Ilara nodded. "Stay away from the door." Ilara unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch. She did not raise the rifle, but held it across her body. "Sheriff," she called out, her voice straining to be heard over the mob's angry murmuring. "This child is sick. He is poisoned by one of your own." This gave them pause. "Poisoned?" Grissom scoffed, though he looked uncertain. "Don't be ridiculous. He's plagued." "She's lying," Prudence shrieked. "It's a trick. Burn it. Burn the witch's nest." A man threw a torch. It landed on the sod roof, sputtering harmlessly in the damp earth. But it was a start. The mob surged, their courage growing. "He was poisoned by a white man!" Ilara screamed, desperate. "His mother was murdered! This baby is a victim!" "Lies!" Grissom yelled, drawing his pistol. "Last chance, Ilara! Give us the child!" The crowd moved forward, a wave of hate. Ilara raised the rifle, her hands slick with sweat, knowing she couldn't stop them all, knowing she was about to die. And then a new sound. A low, resonant call. An eagle's cry, but not from a bird. It echoed from the high ridge behind her. The mob stopped. They turned. The ridge, empty moments before, was now lined with riders. Not 5, not 10. At least 50. They were silent, mounted on wiry ponies. They were not painted for war, but they carried bows, lances, and rifles. They sat, motionless, staring down at the scene. At their head was a man who sat taller than the rest. He wore no war bonnet, just a simple cloth headband, but his presence was one of absolute authority. Sheriff Grissom's face went white. This was the retaliation he had feared, the one he had, in his arrogance, invited. The Hopi riders began to move, not in a charge, but in a slow, deliberate, terrifying procession. They flowed down the ridge like water, splitting to form a wide, silent crescent that sealed off the cabin, trapping the mob between them and the porch. The man at their head rode forward. He stopped his horse 10 feet from Grissom. He was a man in his prime, his face severe, intelligent, and marked by a deep sadness. This was Chief Tave. He did not look at Grissom. He did not look at the mob. He looked at Ilara's cabin door. Sikya, the grandmother, stepped out onto the porch. She stood beside Ilara, small and ancient, yet radiating a power that dwarfed everyone present. Chief Tave dismounted. He walked past Grissom as if he were a tumbleweed. He stopped before Sikya and spoke, his voice low and rhythmic in the Hopi language. "It was a question," Sikya replied. She pointed at Ilara. She pointed at the cabin. Then she pointed at Dr. Thorne, her finger an indictment. Ilara, holding her breath, watched the exchange. The chief's face grew darker. He turned. His gaze swept over the townsfolk, who were frozen in terror. Prudence Holloway's torch seemed to burn lower. When he spoke, his voice was not the guttural savage yell they expected. It was clear, precise, and resonated with the authority of a king. And it was in perfect, unaccented English. "Sheriff Grissom," he said, the name sounding like an insult. Grissom, completely undone, could only stammer. "Chief, we meant no harm. We were here to contain a plague. A misunderstanding." "There is no plague," Chief Tave said, his voice deadly quiet. "There is only a poison and a murderer." He turned to the mob. "The mother of this child, my own niece, was murdered, poisoned. The child was poisoned by the same hand, a hand that belongs to one of you." A collective gasp from the townsfolk. That's a lie," Grissom stuttered. "No white man would." "A man named Malachi Shaw," the chief stated. Ilara watched as a man in the back of the mob, one of the miners, a man named Cyrus, tried to slip away. Instantly, 2 Hopi riders were on him, lances at his throat. "No!" Cyrus screamed. "It wasn't me. It was Malachi. I just gave him a bed." "Malachi Shaw," Chief Tave continued, "is a prospector. He came to our mesas 2 moons ago. We gave him water. He tried to steal our sacred objects. We cast him out. In his drunken rage, he sought revenge. He poisoned the spring my niece used. He is a coward and a butcher." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Sikya, the child's grandmother, found them. Her daughter was gone. The boy was dying. Our own healers were a day's ride away. He would not have lived." He turned his gaze fully on Ilara. It was intense, searching, and held no malice. She knew of this place. She knew of the passage. She knew of the woman who gave water to a Hopi stranger. He stepped toward Ilara. "You," he said. "She placed him in your hearth, a dying child, a desperate hope, and you didn't let him die." Ilara began, but her voice failed. "You took him in," the chief said. "You gave him your warmth. You protected him from them. He gets Grissom and his mob. Then," he continued, "when the poisoner's work took hold, you rode to your own people for help." He looked at Dr. Thorne, his eyes filled with a contempt so profound the doctor visibly shrank. "And your people, your healers, turned you away. They left a child to die." He looked back at Ilara. "You brought him home. You sat with him. You prepared to mourn. And in that moment, you became more his mother than any in this world." He raised his voice, not in song, but in a formal, chanted speech that echoed in the cold air. It was a song of gratitude. "You, who are of the Iron people, have the heart of the Cloud people. You, who live alone, have made a family. You, who were given a dying child, have given him back his life. The debt of the Tep or Sun. Clan is a debt of blood, and it is owed to you, Ilara Harrington." He finished. The silence was absolute. "We captured Malachi Shaw this morning," the chief said, his voice returning to a normal, conversational tone. "He was in this man's wagon." He pointed to Cyrus. "He has confessed. He will be dealt with by our law, as will this one, for sheltering him." His warriors seized the sobbing Cyrus. Grissom, a sheriff, did nothing. He was powerless. His writ was a piece of trash. The confrontation was over. The mob was broken. Prudence Holloway was weeping in silent, terrified rage. Chief Tave looked at Ilara, then at the cabin door. "May I see the child?" Ilara nodded, leading Chief Tave and Sikya into the cabin. The chief's gaze softened as he looked at the recovering Asher, noting he had his mother's eyes. Ilara braced herself, expecting him to take the child. But the chief saw things differently. "He is a bridge, Ilara," he explained. "Poisoned by one world, saved by another." He declared that Sikya would be his sky mother, visiting to teach him his Hopi heritage. But Ilara, who had saved him, would be his hearth mother. "He is your son," Sikya confirmed, speaking her first English words. Tave then stepped back onto the porch and faced the cowering mob. He declared Ilara Harrington and her son, Tio Asher, under the official protection of the Hopi nation. He shamed Grissom and Prudence, warning them that any threat to her was a threat to him. The Hopi departed, leaving the townsfolk to scatter in disgrace. Ilara returned to the cabin, her isolation broken. She was no longer just a widow. She was a protected mother. She picked up her son, the hearth burning brightly in a home that was, finally, no longer empty. The story of Ilara and Asher is a testament to the fact that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it win. In the dust and prejudice of the Old West, she faced down hatred, not with a gun, but with the simple, unshakable power of a mother's love. She proved that family is not always the blood you are born with, but the blood you are willing to fight for. This child, born of one world and raised by another, became a living bridge, and her lonely cabin became the hearth for a new kind of future. Stories like this, raw, real, and full of dramatic twists, are the heart and soul of our shared history. If this story moved you, please help us share it by hitting that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss a new video. And tell us in the comments below, what part of Ilara's story hit you the hardest? We love bringing these hidden dramas to light. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.